Welcome back to Indiana Newsdesk. East Chicago is dealing with a serious contamination of lead in its soil. It's been steadily getting worse for decades. The EPA notified people this summer that contamination had reached dangerous levels. And as Claire McInerney reports, that's raising more questions that no one seems able to answer.
Byron Duke Florence was born in East Chicago, Indiana, and although he's lived in other places, he always returned back to the town he considers home. He now owns the house he grew up in. He thought he'd live here for a long time, but recently that changed.
Did I prepare to get up and go? No, but I'm willing to have left yesterday.
The Environmental Protection Agency recently deemed the soil in his neighborhood dangerous after finding high levels of lead and arsenic in the soil. It's something they've been monitoring for 20 years now. The news frightens Florence as he remembers being a kid in the neighborhood 50 years ago, when one of his favorite activities with his friends was digging tunnels under neighborhood fences near the lead plants.
And we used to see them when they dumped those 55-gallon barrels along the railroad tracks. And they would bulldoze them over. And we would go right behind them and try to dig them up and poke holes in the barrels, watching stuff come up. I mean, it was, our exposure was direct, plain and simple. We tracked that stuff back in our houses.
East Chicago used to be home to the U.S.S. lead facility, as well as other smelters and refineries, which operated in the town for decades. Through air emissions from the factories and burying waste products, which is a legally allowed disposal method, lead can get into the soil, contaminating it. Lead contamination is measured in parts per million. That's 1 part lead for every million parts soil. Or think of it this way, 1 part per million is a single needle in a 1-ton stack of hay. The EPA allows lead levels in the soil around residential areas to reach 400 parts per million. In East Chicago, lead levels have been measured as high as 45,000 parts per million in the top 6 inches of soil. The worst of the contamination is in the Calumet neighborhood, where Florence lives. The EPA has divided the contamination into 3 zones. Zone 1, which houses Carrie Gosh Elementary School and an apartment complex, is the most contaminated spot. The mayor of East Chicago, Anthony Copeland, ordered the West Calumet housing complex to be demolished, so more than 1,000 people will be displaced. The elementary school also moved all of its students into an abandoned middle school for the year.
If you do something like this to a community of people, devalue their lives like this, then you're going to be punished. And we don't want to see it happen again.
Senator Lonnie Randolph represents East Chicago in the state Senate and grew up in the Calumet neighborhood. He is trying to work with residents as well as state and federal agencies to make sure people are getting enough information. But he says right now there is a lot of confusion and a lot of concerns about what living on lead for years means.
You got a lot of families that's there who are saying that, hey, I've got 3 kids and I remember when Bobby had a cold and so-and-so had a flu and Jimmy was vomiting all the time and Johnny was hyperactive in school. Hey, I never knew what it was. The doctors couldn't tell me. Maybe it was this lead.
And the unknown health effects of long-term lead exposure also concerns Florence. After living in the Calumet neighborhood for most of his 64 years, he got blood tested for the first time recently. He's waiting for the results. He thinks about how over the years he's been diagnosed with high blood pressure, diabetes, and is in remission from bone cancer. A question he and many residents are asking, did the lead cause this? For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Claire McInerney.
And Claire McInerney joins us now for more. Claire, you were up there. Yeah. And so the question is, why is this such a big deal in this community now when the EPA has known about this for years?
Right, so they have been monitoring it for decades, and they knew that it was contaminated. And in 2009, they deemed it a Superfund site, which means the EPA would start putting resources to clean it up. But I think it's just gotten steadily worse since then. And a few months ago, the EPA started notifying families that your home is on very contaminated soil. We're going to be there cleaning up. And so they were scared to send their kids to the school. So the school decided to move. Then the mayor decided to tear down that complex. And I think that all raised these huge concerns about what was going on.
So you mentioned in the story that these zones that the EPA designated. What do those zones mean?
So it's important to know that all 3 zones have very dangerous soil. It's very contaminated. Zone 1 is the worst, and that's where the school was and this housing complex was. And it's getting cleaned, but the people who live there that are being displaced are receiving federal money to move. So that's the worst area. Zone 3 is also being cleaned up. Zone 2 is kind of tricky because nothing is happening to the soil there because the EPA isn't able to prove what company contaminated it, so they can't figure out who to charge for the cleanup. So right now, the people who live in Zone 2, including Byron, who was in my package, is getting no money to help move and just has to sit tight, and they all feel very trapped, the people who live in Zone 2.
So when you say they're cleaning up right now, what does that mean, they're cleaning up?
You know, I'm not quite sure, but when
Yeah.
I was there, we saw EPA officials all over this neighborhood, and they're digging and they're putting things in bags to test how bad it is. And I think, you know, once the housing complex is destroyed, they'll go through and just really go, you know, do their processes to figure out how to make this livable again.
We have about 30 seconds. You said a school located there is contaminated. What's happening to the school and the kids that are there?
So they were moved to this abandoned middle school, which structurally isn't correct for elementary school kids. So the state has given them $3 million in a loan to do some construction and make the school more like lower toilets, lower counters, and things like that. But it is disruptive to education, so it's not a great situation for those kids.
All right, more to come, I assume. Thank you very
Absolutely.
much, Claire.
Thanks.